ancestral property. You know, for so many of us, those words carry this incredible weight of history, of family, of legacy. But what happens when that property gets sold? Can a deal that's already done ever really be undone? Well, today we're going to unpack that exact question. When can a sale of Hindu joint family property actually be challenged and overturned?
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with who even gets to object to a sale in the first place. Then we'll get into a really surprising twist in the law about an unborn challenger. After that, we hit the core of the issue, the legal necessity test. We'll also see why gifts are a whole different ballgame from sales. And finally, we'll ask, what about the buyer? What happens to them if a deal is reversed?
So first things first, before you can even question a sale, you've got to have the legal right to stand up in court and say, hey, wait a minute, not just anyone can do it.
This is really the question that gets to the heart of it all. You know, just imagine a property that's been in your family for generations is suddenly sold off by a relative. Is there anything you can do? Can you get it back? The answer is, well, it's complicated.
All right, before we go any further, let's just get one piece of legal jargon out of the way. The word is alienation. It sounds a bit strange, but all it means is transferring property. So when we say alienation, we're talking about the whole shebang. A sale, a gift, even a mortgage. It's all alienation.
Let's move on to what is, honestly, one of the most fascinating and kind of mind-bending parts of this whole area of law. The rights of a family member who wasn't even born when the property was sold.
And this all goes back to a huge, game-changing case, Sabapathy versus Somasundaran. This case laid down an incredible principle. It said that a copper center, that's basically a joint heir, who was in the womb when the property was sold, can actually grow up and sue to have that sale overturned. It's wild. Their right to challenge is protected even before they're born.
And this timeline just shows you exactly how it works. So you've got a father, let's call him A, and his son B. Back in 1960, the father, A, sells the property. Now his grandson, C, isn't even born yet. He doesn't come along for another 10 years. But, and this is the key, because C's father, B, was alive when the sale happened, the right to challenge that sale was kept alive. That right then gets passed down to C when he's born, allowing him to sue over a deal that was made a full decade before he existed.
But, and this is a huge but, you can't wait forever. The right to challenge isn't infinite. There's a ticking clock. The Limitation Act says you've got 12 years from the date the buyer actually takes possession of the property to make your move. After that, the window closes.
Okay, now we're getting to the real make-or-break issue. Once someone proves they have the right to challenge a sale, what's their actual argument? Well, the most common reason a court will throw out a sale is because it fails something called the legal necessity test. This is the legal battleground where these cases are really won or lost. So what on earth is legal necessity? Think of it this way. You can't just sell ancestral property for any old reason. The sale has to be for the benefit of the whole family. So things like paying off serious family debts, covering major medical bills, or paying for essential ceremonies, that stuff counts. Just selling it for your own personal gain? Nope, that's not going to fly. And courts take this test very, very seriously. Just look at these two cases. In the first one, Srinath v. Jagannath, property was sold for 6,000 rupees. But the court found there was only a real need for about half of that, 3,200. Since so much of the sale wasn't justified, they set the whole thing aside. But then you look at Nijamat Rai v. Dindale. A 43,000 rupee sale was upheld because almost all of it, 38,000, was used to pay off a legitimate family debt.
You can see the logic pretty clearly in these notes. If the sale is mostly for a legal necessity, a court will probably let it stand. But if a big chunk of that money can't be accounted for by a real family need, the entire deal is in danger of being canceled.
Now, this is where things get even more complicated. What if a father sells property for his own personal debts, things that don't benefit the family? A son can absolutely sue, but then another legal idea comes into play, the doctrine of pious obligation, which is a son's traditional duty to pay his father's debts as long as they weren't for immoral reasons. And different courts have totally different ideas on this. Calcutta's High Court says, okay, the son might have to pay the buyer back to get the property, but other courts, like in Madras and Allahabad, saying no way. They say the sale gets canceled first, and it's up to the buyer to sue separately to try and get their money back. It's a real legal tangle.
So we've talked a lot about sales, but what about another type of alienation? One with even stricter rules. I'm talking about just giving the property away as a gift.
Yeah, the basic rule here is pretty simple. You can't do it
You can't just gift your share of the joint family property to someone. A 1973 case made that crystal clear. But there's always a but, right? Check out this really interesting exception from a 1970 case. It found that if you transfer a share to a bride as part of a marriage arrangement, it's not legally considered a gift. It's a transfer for value, and that makes it perfectly valid.
And this quote from another case points out a crucial distinction. If you give up your share to the other family members, the other co-parceners, that's called relinquishment. And that is not considered a gift. It's a totally legitimate way to move shares around inside the family unit.
Okay, so let's say the family member wins. They go to court, they prove there was no legal necessity. The judge bangs the gavel, and the sale is officially set aside. Great for them, but what about the person who bought the property maybe years ago and thought everything was above board? I mean, this is a huge question of fairness, right? Does the buyer, who might have acted in totally good faith, just lose everything they paid? Well, the law tries to find a balance here, and that's where the idea of equity comes in. The case of Paramanicum Pillai is the perfect example of how courts try to be fair to everybody involved. It shows that even when a sale gets undone, the buyer isn't just left out in the cold. So let's follow the money in this case. 6 acres of family land had been sold for 13,000 rupees. Now, the actual market value at the time was a little higher, 16,000 rupees. But the court made a really interesting point. The son who was suing couldn't really complain about getting a low price because that loss was his father's fault, not the buyer's. And here it is. This is equity in action. The court did cancel the sale, but it said to the son, you don't get this property back for free. To get his half share of the land back, the son was ordered to pay 3,500 rupees back to the buyer. This way, the son's inheritance is protected, but the buyer's investment is also recognized. All right, so let's pull all this together. What are the big takeaways? First, the right to challenge a sale of family property is really broad, even for someone who wasn't born yet. Second, it all comes down to that legal necessity test. Third, even if only part of a sale was unjustified, the whole thing could still be canceled. And finally, courts are all about balance. They'll almost always make the family pay back some money to the buyer to make things fair. And that really leaves us with the big final question, doesn't it? This whole area of law is like a tightrope walk between two really important ideas: protecting a family's ancestral legacy on one side and protecting an innocent buyer's rights on the other. It really makes you think, where exactly should the law draw that line?